LeT's parent organization, the Markaz Dawat wal Irshad, was born in 1986 when its emir, or the man who became its emir, Hafiz Saeed, merged his primarily missionary organization with a militant outfit led by Zakir Rahman Lakvi, who is the man now on trial for planning the Mumbai attacks, the 2008 Mumbai attacks. So from the outset, it was a missionary and a militant organization. Lashkar was launched in 1990 as the armed wing of MDI. But essentially, if you know their philosophy, you don't really separate between the two. And it fought on multiple fronts during the 1990s. The foremost of them was in Kashmir. And it became powerful with the help of state support. And its strength is actually born of weakness in that it is a Ali Hadith organization. And most of the militant groups in Pakistan are Deobandi. And so because LET was Ali Hadith and because it was estranged from the wider Ali Hadith movement, the army and the ISI thought that lacking natural allies in the country, it would be more easy to control. And so they infused it with a great amount of support. And Lashkar proved itself to be a very obedient, reliable, and aggressive proxy against India in Indian-administered Kashmir. And with the help of state support, it was able to build up both its missionary and its militant capabilities. And one must distinguish between the relationship during the 1990s and even earlier during this decade, and then, of course, after General Musharraf resigned from power. Today, I think it's fair to say that the civilian government's relationship with Lashkar-e-Taiba is very different than the ISI's relationship. And, of course, elements within the ISI are much closer to LET. But it's also important to note that one of Lashkar's strengths is not just that it has close relations with elements within the ISI, it also has close relations with elements in the army, and also, to a lesser degree, but still significant, in the civilian bureaucracy and in law enforcement. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, it remains a useful, reliable proxy against India. But secondly, and perhaps more important today, is the fact that Lashkar-e-Taiba is one of the few groups that's not attacking the Pakistani state. And so it is seen as in a different light than are many of these other groups. And then finally, through its social outreach, through its above-ground organization, it provides a lot of important services. And for that reason, that has also enabled it to build ties, as I said, with the civilian bureaucracy, and in particular at the provincial level in Punjab. At the time of the Mumbai attacks, there was a peace process in the works. It was called the Composite Dialogue, and it was stumbling along. It wasn't in great shape, but it was still extant. And of course, the Composite Dialogue was put on hold after the Mumbai attacks. They are beginning. There's a beginning of a thaw in the relationship. The two sides are beginning to talk to one another at official levels about some of the important issues. There's still obviously a very long way to go, and this is complicated by the fact that in addition to the composite dialogue, there was also a back channel that was taking place regarding territorial disputes, particularly Kashmir. And of course, there's disagreement about how far along they were in those back channel talks, and the current civilian government is reluctant to even acknowledge any type of agreements that were reached thus far. So all of these complicating factors make it difficult for them to move forward. But as I said, they are talking more than they were a year or two ago. Another LET attack, another mass LET attack, would at the very least derail the thaw that is taking place between these two countries, and could present a situation where you have India preparing for war against Pakistan. Now, that's something that, at the moment, it seems the Army and the ISI are taking steps to prevent, because they don't want another major attack, because they don't want war. But of course, so long as LET exists, the capacity exists to either use them for that purpose, or that they could launch an attack without sanction if they see a peace deal on the horizon, and there's concern that, with that will come their own demobilization. So I think in terms of how India and Pakistan are going to move forward, LET is going to be very much a part of that process. And whenever I speak with Indians about, Pakistan relations, LET is always at the forefront of their discussions, and what are we going to do about the LET? Added on to that, the fact that LET not only launches its own strikes against India, but it has also provided a lot of support to an indigenous jihadist movement in India. And then, of course, there are questions about, well, even if you're able to rein in LET and keep them from launching attacks, can we necessarily stop LET from providing support via transnational networks as well? And how will that potentially complicate a peace process? So there are a lot of different things that need to happen to take the group apart. And I would argue that it needs to be degraded over time, not just domestically, but also transnationally, to make sure that any action against it and that any action against it does not lead to greater threats for instability in the region. I would say that LET's short-term objectives have expanded, or rather it is beginning to act on goals that it has always voiced. So it was born as a pan-Islamist organization, one that was going to fight on multiple fronts. And now it's always prioritized India, and I think it's fair to say that the leadership still does prioritize India as its main enemy. But as the Kashmir Jihad has waned, and the Afghan insurgency has expanded, Lashkar is increasingly participating on that front. And that infuses an element of anti-Americanism into the group, particularly among some of the younger generation. And so you get a real tension within the organization right now about whether to stay true to an identity as a Pakistani proxy vis-a-vis India, which it has been historically, or whether to embrace its pan-Islamist ideology, which is increasingly, as I said, being infused by this anti-Americanism. Well, LET's capabilities dwarf many of the other militant outfits in Pakistan and internationally. It's got a very robust training apparatus because of the level of state support that it received for some time. Its training infrastructure has quite a lot of cachet. Its militants are among the best trained, and its trainers are quite capable as well. And it still has an above-ground infrastructure in Pakistan, which means that you can link up with that training apparatus or with other groups through the above-ground infrastructure. It's also got transnational networks that span multiple continents. So for all of those reasons, in terms of its capabilities, it has the ability to threaten the U.S. and its allies quite a bit. Now, the flip side of that is that because it remains closer to the Pakistani state than a lot of these other groups, and because it doesn't want to lose its above-ground infrastructure, there is a degree of leverage over it that officials have that they don't have over other groups. So capabilities are quite threatening. Intent, more difficult to gauge. One of the emerging dangers that I would point to is the fact that because there are tensions in the organization over whether or not to expand the scope of its jihad, the degree to which factions within LET might use some of these capabilities without their leaders' sanction. And I think that's one of the areas that, as we move forward, we will be continually, and to a greater extent concerned about. First of all, some of its members are fighting in Afghanistan right now, where they are actively killing coalition forces. So that is, of course, a threat. Then there is the threat that comes from its ability to facilitate or support attacks against either the U.S. homeland or other Western countries, or U.S. or Western interests in South Asia. And there's the threat, that it poses as a group that can help with recruiting, that can help with financing attacks, that can help with facilitation or or performing reconnaissance, provision of safe houses for people in Pakistan, provision of false papers, all these different things that one needs to pull off a terrorist attack. And of course, it can provide the training as well. And then there is the threat of a unilateral attack in which LET isn't just providing support as part of a consortium. And there, again, I would say that it has the capabilities to strike, certainly within South Asia, as we've seen with the Mumbai attacks. It attempted an attack in Australia in 2003, and it was looking at an attack in Denmark in 2008. So it certainly has the capacity to support other organizations, also to launch its own attacks. Although, again, I would come back to, within the organization, some of the senior leaders, in terms of their intent, they might be able to be dissuaded by the army and the ISI. The concern is, do they have control over all of the apparatus? I would question the degree to which it is a very robust relationship. They historically have ties going back to the 1980s, and that's not surprising. Al-Qaeda was born in Afghanistan during the anti-Soviet jihad, and as was Lashkar-e-Taiba, or at least its parent organization. And of course, there's been collaboration, during the 1990s in terms of training, and then certainly this decade. LET has provided facilitation or support to Al-Qaeda both within Pakistan and, we believe, for attacks overseas. Now, because LET's senior leaders are closer to the Army and the ISI, there is a trust deficit, which is to say that Al-Qaeda operatives are going to be very careful around LET. And there are instances of Lashkar members actually being used against insurgents in Pakistan who are launching attacks against the state. And so one gets a situation in which the best way I could describe it would be to say that there's separateness and there's togetherness. There's competition and there's collaboration. They work together, but they don't always trust one another. I think several things are impinging on action against LET. And to put it quite bluntly, as a member of the Pakistan Security Services did to me several years ago, he said, rhetorically, who gains if we go after Lashkar-e-Taiba and who loses? And the answer is where India would gain and Pakistan would pay the costs, because Lashkar-e-Taiba is one of the few groups that's not attacking the Pakistani state. And they want to make sure that they don't take steps that's going to draw LET further into that insurgency. So that's number one. The costs are deemed to be prohibitive. And then number two, the group still has utility. At the very least, it provides Pakistan with leverage at the negotiating table in terms of any future peace deal with India or their ability to pursue such a peace deal. So the costs are high, the benefits to them appear low. Now that said, I do believe that there is recognition among some quarters in the security establishment that over the long term, LET poses a potential threat to the state. The question is what to do about it. And I think one thing that a lot of us can agree on is that any action against LET needs to be a process. The group needs to be dismantled via a process, rather than necessarily a hammer-like crackdown that could splinter the organization and create greater threats for Pakistan, for India, and for the West. Moving along those lines, I would argue that Pakistan needs to be exploring, as I believe they're beginning to, programs for deradicalization, or at least disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And there also needs to be additional capacity building, particularly for law enforcement in Punjab, where the potential for a backlash is greatest.